Hello and welcome to the Story Atelier. If you're someone who loves captivating, suspenseful stories full of twists and life lessons, then you've come to the right place. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an exciting story from us. Each tale we share is carefully crafted, and we hope to bring you unforgettable moments of entertainment. Thank you for supporting the Story Atelier. We're excited to have you on this journey with us, and we can't wait to share more stories with you in the future. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the calm river. Ethan sat on the banks, his fishing rod propped against a worn-out rock, the line floating lazily in the water. The world seemed to slow down as the breeze whispered through the trees, and the only sound was the occasional splash of a fish jumping. This was Ethan's sanctuary, a place he could forget about the noise and struggles of the world. At just 14 years old, life hadn't been easy for Ethan. His father had passed away 3 years ago in a tragic factory accident, leaving his mother, Laura, to raise him alone. They had never been wealthy, and their modest home in the outskirts of Red Brick was a far cry from the mansion that Ethan sometimes saw on TV. The homes of the wealthy and powerful people in the city. But despite the hardships, Ethan found peace here by the river. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for him, it was survival. A good catch meant dinner, and in a small household like his, that was something to be grateful for. Today, however, the fish weren't biting, the line remained taut but unyielding, and Ethan wasn't bothered by it. He didn't mind the stillness. In fact, the quiet was comforting. His thoughts wandered back to his father's death, how it had shattered their family, how his mother worked long hours at the hospital to make ends meet. She had sacrificed so much for him, and Ethan wished he could do more to make things better. But for now, this river, with its quiet whispers and secrets, was all he had. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the stillness, sending a jolt through Ethan's body. His heart raced as he instinctively ducked down into the bushes, hiding himself from view. His breath quickened as he peered through the thick leaves, trying to understand what was happening. His eyes locked onto a black SUV parked in the middle of the bridge upstream, the engine running quietly. Ethan squinted, trying to make out the figures. A man had stepped out of the car and was now walking toward the edge of the bridge. Ethan's pulse quickened, and a strange sense of unease crept over him. Something didn't feel right. His suspicions were confirmed when the man suddenly leaned over the railing and pushed something, or someone, into the river. Ethan's stomach twisted, and his breath caught in his throat. The splash echoed through the evening air, sending chills down his spine. The man turned quickly, jumped back into the car, and sped away without a second glance. Ethan's eyes darted to the river, scanning the water for any sign of what had just been thrown over. His heart stopped when he saw a hand rise briefly above the surface, then disappear again, drifting slowly with the current. Without thinking, Ethan jumped to his feet, panic seizing him. Someone was in the water, and they weren't moving. He knew he had to act fast. The river was swift, and whoever it was didn't have much time. Ethan kicked off his sneakers, dropped his fishing rod, and sprinted toward the bank. The sharp rocks scraped against his bare feet, but he didn't care. He had no choice. He had to save them. By the time he reached the river's edge, the body had already been carried farther downstream, the current pulling it faster than Ethan could run. Without a second thought, he dove into the water. The cold hit him like a wall, and the strength of the current nearly knocked him off course. For a moment, he flailed helplessly, struggling to stay afloat. His heart pounded in his chest, and his muscles screamed in protest. But Ethan pushed forward. He had to get to the person in the water. Through the murky current, he saw the figure again. Closer now, an older man, his face pale and lifeless. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and a surge of adrenaline propelled him forward. The man was unconscious, barely clinging to life. Ethan reached out, his hands trembling as he grabbed the man by the arm. Every muscle in his body burned as he fought against the current, pulling the man toward the shore. His strength was fading, but the thought of leaving him to drown was unbearable. With one final effort, Ethan managed to get the man to the muddy riverbank. He collapsed beside him, gasping for air, the cool evening breeze biting at his wet skin. For a long moment, Ethan lay there, trying to catch his breath, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Finally, he rolled over and glanced at the man he had pulled from the water. The man was elderly, his silver hair matted to his head, his face battered, a deep gash on his temple. Blood trickled down his face. Ethan swallowed hard, his stomach turned at the sight of the blood, but then he noticed the faint rise and fall of the man's chest. He was alive, barely, but alive. Ethan's heart lifted with a rush of relief. He had done it, but now, the question was, what next? Ethan's mind raced as he knelt beside the injured man, trying to assess the situation. His heart pounded in his chest, still racing from the rush of swimming through the cold river and dragging the man to safety. He looked around the desolate riverbank, searching for any sign of help. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. He quickly realized he had no phone, no way to call for assistance. In his panic, he must have left it behind. The nearest hospital was over an hour away by car, and the man in front of him was in no condition to wait that long. Ethan glanced down at his clothes. He didn't have much on him. His jeans and t-shirt were soaked, and his sneakers were long abandoned in the rush to save the man. As his gaze flickered over the man's face, the faintest stir of consciousness made Ethan's heart skip a beat. The elderly man's eyelids fluttered, but he didn't wake up. Ethan carefully pulled the man's arm across his shoulder and began the slow, painful walk back toward the woods. There was no other choice. He couldn't leave him here alone, exposed to the elements. His mother would be furious, but he didn't care. This man's life was on the line. The path back to his small house seemed to stretch endlessly before him. His arms trembled under the weight of the man, but Ethan pushed forward. He ignored the burning pain in his legs, focused only on the task at hand. With every step, he found himself silently praying that the man would hold on until he could get him home. His mother, Laura, was a nurse. She'd know what to do. By the time Ethan reached the front door, his entire body was shaking with exhaustion. He pushed it open with his shoulder, his breath ragged. Laura was in the kitchen, her back to the door as she worked on a meal. Ethan's arrival didn't go unnoticed, though. She turned at the sound of his heavy footsteps, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Ethan, what on earth?" She stopped in her tracks when she saw the condition of the man he was supporting. Her face went pale, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "I found him by the river," Ethan gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone threw him off the bridge." Laura took a step forward, her shock quickly replaced by instinct. She was a nurse, after all, trained to handle emergencies. "Get him inside," she said, her voice sharp but calm. Ethan nodded, dragging the man into the small living room, where he gently lowered him onto the couch. Laura rushed to the man's side, her hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. She checked his pulse, her eyes narrowing as she felt the weak, labored beat. Her fingers hovered over his temple where the blood had begun to dry. The gash was deep, but it wasn't the only injury. Bruises lined his wrists, as if he had been bound tightly. There were dark marks along his ribs, too, signs of internal trauma. "This is bad," Laura muttered, her brow furrowing in concentration. She pulled a towel from the chair beside the couch and started cleaning the blood from the man's forehead. Ethan stood quietly by, watching her work, his stomach tight with worry. "Who is he, Mom?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Laura replied, her focus still on the man. "But we need to keep him alive first, and then we'll figure it out." She paused for a moment, her fingers brushing against the man's wrist. "Ethan, we need to get him to the hospital. But I can't get him there alone. We're going to have to try and stabilize him first." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the man's pale face. "Is he going to make it?" "I don't know," Laura said softly, her expression grim. but we'll do everything we can." Ethan swallowed hard. He felt a sense of helplessness settle over him. The man's survival was in their hands, and it was up to his mother to save him. But as much as Ethan wanted to believe everything would be okay, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Whoever had thrown this man off the bridge clearly didn't want him to live, and that meant danger was coming. "Do you think someone's looking for him?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but full of concern. Laura didn't answer immediately. She looked over her shoulder at him, her face tight with worry. "I'm not sure, but if they're looking for him, we'll have to deal with that later. Right now, he needs care." Ethan nodded, though a pit of unease settled in his stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. But for now, he had to trust his mother. She had always been the one who kept them going, even when things seemed impossible. He glanced back at the man on the couch, noting the silver hair and the fragile look in his face. Who was he, and why had someone wanted him dead? Hours passed before the man finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open. His gaze was unfocused, his lips moving silently as he tried to make sense of where he was. Laura leaned in, her hands gently touching his arm. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. The man groaned, his eyes flickering with confusion. "Wah, where am I?" His voice was weak, hoarse, barely a whisper. "You're safe now," Laura said, trying to reassure him. "You were thrown in the river, but my son saved you." The man's eyes snapped open, his pupils dilating as if struggling to understand. He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he reached up to touch the bandage around his head. He winced, his face contorting in pain. "The river, I remember." His voice trailed off as if trying to piece together the fragmented memories. "I was thrown." Ethan watched from the corner of the room, his curiosity piqued. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice hesitant but eager for answers. The man's face went pale as he looked up at Ethan. His lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment, he just stared at Ethan, his eyes filled with disbelief. "It was Alan," the man finally managed, his voice weak but clear. "Alan Foster, my son-in-law. He tried to kill me." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the man's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ethan stood frozen, trying to process what he had just heard. Alan Foster, the name sounded vaguely familiar, but Ethan couldn't place it. Who was this man, and why had his son-in-law tried to kill him? Laura's face tightened with concern. She glanced at Ethan briefly before turning her full attention to the man on the couch. "You said Alan Foster?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Your son-in-law?" The man nodded weakly, his gaze flickering between them. "Yes, Alan Foster," he repeated, his voice strained. "He's been running my affairs for years, pretending to be trustworthy, pretending to care about my family. But he's been siphoning money from me, using my name, my foundation to fund his own projects, his own lifestyle." Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the story. A rich, elderly man, a son-in-law with access to his wealth, and now a murder attempt. It sounded like something straight out of a movie, not like something that could happen to real people. But the man's pained expression and the blood on the floor told Ethan otherwise. "I don't understand," Laura said softly. "Why would Alan do this? Why would he risk your life like this?" The man took a slow, shaky breath. "Greed," he said bitterly. "Pure greed. He thought I wouldn't catch on. But I did. I started noticing the discrepancies, the missing funds, the fake invoices. I confronted him. I showed him the evidence. But instead of owning up to it, he snapped. He lost control. I thought I could handle it. But when I tried to get him to explain, he became violent. That's when he attacked me. He tried to kill me. Threw me off the bridge, hoping I'd drown." Ethan's stomach churned as the man's words sank in. His hand clenched into a fist. This wasn't just a robbery or a theft. This was something much darker. A betrayal that had nearly cost the man his life. Ethan glanced over at his mother, Laura was looking at the man with a mixture of disbelief and caution. "This is unbelievable," Laura muttered, shaking her head slowly. "What do you want us to do?" The man, Richard, as he had finally introduced himself, took a deep breath and winced from the pain in his ribs. "I don't know yet," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I'm not sure what I can do right now. Alan is dangerous. He'll stop at nothing to cover his tracks. But there's something else. I have evidence, documents, records, things that prove what he's done. They're at my estate, but I can't go back. Not yet." Ethan's heart raced. This was bigger than anything he could have imagined. The man who had nearly drowned, the man they had saved, was not just a random stranger. He was a millionaire, a philanthropist, someone with power, with connections. And now, he was sitting in their small living room, hiding from his own son-in-law, the very person who should have been taking care of him. "Why can't you go back?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. Richard looked at Ethan, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Because if I go back to my estate now, Alan will find me. He has people, he has connections. I've seen the way he works. He'll deny everything, and he'll make sure no one believes me." Laura leaned against the table, her arms crossed as she processed the information. "Then what's the plan?" she asked, her tone calm but resolute. Richard let out a long sigh. "I'm not sure, but I know I need those documents. They're locked in my office. They're the key to bringing him down. If I can get them, I can go to the authorities. But I can't go alone." Ethan stepped forward, his mind made up. "I can help," he said firmly. Laura shot him a sharp look. But Ethan didn't back down. "I know the area. I've been around that estate before. I can get in and out without anyone noticing. Just tell me what I need to do." Richard looked at Ethan with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "I appreciate it, kid, but I can't ask you to put yourself in danger." Ethan's gaze hardened. "I'm already in danger. I saved your life. I'm not going to just let this guy get away with it." Laura stepped in, her expression conflicted. "Ethan, this is too much. You're just a kid." Ethan looked up at his mother, meeting her eyes with determination. "I know what's at stake here. Mom, I know it's dangerous, but I can't sit back and let this man hurt you. Hurt us. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he doesn't get away with it." Laura hesitated, her brow furrowed with worry. "Ethan." Richard put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm for someone so weak. "He's right, Laura. We can't wait around. Alan is out there, and he's not going to stop until he's buried this whole thing. We need those documents, and we need to make sure we have enough evidence to make sure he's put away for good." There was a long pause as Laura looked between the two of them. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but laced with concern. "Okay, but we're doing this carefully. And you're not going alone. Ethan, I'll come with you." Ethan's heart surged with a mix of relief and anxiety. He knew this was a risk, but it was the only way to make sure that justice was done. Alan couldn't be allowed to get away with this. With a plan in motion, they spent the next few hours preparing. Laura called a friend to keep an eye on the house, just in case Alan's people came looking. Ethan and Richard discussed the layout of the estate, and the risks they would be facing. As night fell, the air grew heavy with tension. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he tied his shoes, readying himself for what was to come. This was no longer about just saving a stranger, it was about standing up for what was right. They left the house under the cover of darkness, and the quiet town of Red Brick seemed to hold its breath, unaware of the dangerous mission unfolding under its very nose. The night was thick with tension as Ethan, Laura, and Richard made their way to the outskirts of Red Brick. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a faint silver glow over the quiet streets. Laura drove cautiously, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she kept a watchful eye on the road. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing with the weight of what they were about to do. They were headed to Richard's estate, the place where Alan Foster's greed had festered, and where the evidence they needed to bring him down was locked away. Richard sat in the back, his face drawn with exhaustion but his resolve firm. He had barely spoken since they left the house, his thoughts no doubt consumed by what lay ahead. Ethan could feel the pressure building in the air, the knowledge that this mission was their only chance to stop Alan and expose the truth. As they approached the sprawling estate, Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of disbelief. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark windows reflecting the night. The place that once symbolized Richard's wealth and success now felt like a prison. A place where the betrayal and lies had taken root. Ethan could sense the danger that lingered, the shadows of Alan's influence creeping over everything. "Stay close," Laura said in a low voice as she parked the car a few blocks away, out of sight of the estate. "We don't know how many people Alan has working for him. We need to be careful." Ethan nodded, his stomach tight with nerves. He had seen enough crime movies to know how these things usually went. There were always twists, always dangers they hadn't anticipated. But this was real. There was no script to follow, no second chances. They had to succeed, not just for Richard's sake, but for the sake of justice. The three of them moved quietly through the streets, staying hidden in the shadows. Richard led them, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he navigated the path to his office window, the one where he had locked the crucial documents. Ethan's heart raced as they approached the back of the mansion. The estate seemed even more imposing in the dark, the high walls and tall gates creating a sense of isolation. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful town could house something so sinister. They reached the back door, where Richard motioned for them to wait. He looked around, checking for any signs of movement. "This is it," he whispered. "The office is on the second floor. We'll have to be quick. Once we're inside, I'll get the documents, and then we leave. No detours, no distractions." Ethan's mind was spinning, but he nodded. He knew that once they stepped inside, there was no turning back. They didn't have the luxury of time, and they couldn't afford to make a sound. Richard pulled a small key from his pocket, unlocking the back door. It creaked open, and they slipped inside, moving silently through the dimly lit hallways. The mansion felt eerily quiet, its grandeur masking the darkness within. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they climbed the stairs, the old wood beneath their feet creaking faintly with each step. When they reached the second floor, Richard led him down a narrow hallway to a door at the end. He paused, listening intently for any sounds from within. Then, with a quiet push, the door opened, and they stepped into his office. Ethan's eyes immediately scanned the room. The large desk, the stacks of papers, the shelves lined with books, everything looked so normal. Yet the tension in the air told him it wasn't. Richard moved quickly, heading straight to a locked drawer in the desk. He opened it with another key and pulled out a thick folder, the documents inside neatly arranged. "This is it," Richard said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "These are the records of Alan's fraudulent activities. With this, we can prove everything." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. They had it, the key to ending Alan's reign of terror. But just as Richard was about to close the drawer, a sound echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end as the footsteps grew louder. Laura's eyes widened, and she motioned for them to move quickly. "We need to go, now." But it was too late. The door to the office slammed open, and in the doorway stood two men, large, intimidating figures, dressed in dark suits. Behind them stood Alan Foster, his face twisted in a snarl of rage. "So, this is how it's going to be," Alan sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can take me down with a few pathetic documents? You've made a huge mistake, Richard, a huge mistake." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He had no idea how Alan had found them, but it didn't matter now. They were trapped. Richard's eyes narrowed as he stood between Alan and the others, holding the folder tightly in his hand. "You won't get away with this, Alan. I have everything I need to expose you. It's over." Alan's sneer deepened, and he stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you're in control? You're nothing but a pawn in a much bigger game. I've made sure of that." Suddenly, the door behind them burst open, and 2 more men rushed into the room, blocking their escape. Ethan's mind raced as he glanced around, trying to think of a way out. He couldn't let Alan win, not after everything they had been through. Then, a thought flashed in his mind. The fire escape. If they could make it to the back door, they could get out and take the documents with them. They just needed a distraction. "Mom, now," Ethan hissed. Without thinking, Laura grabbed a vase from the desk and hurled it toward the window. The glass shattered with a loud crash, and Alan's men flinched. It was all the distraction Ethan needed. In an instant, he grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him toward the fire escape at the far end of the office. They sprinted down the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing in the night. Behind them, they could hear Alan's voice, shouting orders, but they didn't stop. The cold night air hit them as they burst out of the back door and into the alley. Ethan didn't stop running until they reached the car. Laura was already in the driver's seat, her hands on the wheel, waiting for them. Richard jumped in beside her, and they sped off, leaving the estate and its dark secrets behind them. The next few days were a blur. The evidence they had collected made its way into the hands of the authorities. And soon after, the media exploded with the story of Alan Foster's embezzlement and attempted murder. His empire crumbled, and he was arrested, facing charges that would likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. But for Ethan, it wasn't over. The events of the past week had changed him forever. He had faced danger, stood up against a powerful man, and come out victorious. He had proven that even in the face of fear, courage could change everything. As they sat together in their modest living room, watching the news coverage of Alan's arrest, Ethan felt a strange sense of pride. The truth had come out, and justice had been served. "Good job, kid," Richard said quietly, offering him a small smile. Ethan smiled back, feeling the weight of the journey lift off his shoulders. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. Laura looked at her son, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done more than just save a life," she said softly. "You've made a difference." And in that moment, Ethan realized just how far he had come. He had stepped into a world of danger, of deception, and betrayal, but he had come out the other side stronger, more certain of who he was, and what he was capable of. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready for whatever came next.